Dust does not just choke the lungs, it buries pride. It settles into the creases of a man's face and makes him look 10 years older than he is. It coats the kitchen table where a family eats dinner in silence, and it films over the windows until the world outside looks like a faded photograph of a place that used to matter. But before the dust came, before the wells ran dry and the fields turned to ash, before a 16-year-old boy stood alone beneath 70 feet of rusted iron and made a promise that would cost him everything, there was a night that nobody in Hemlock County would ever forget. Picture a county road. No moon, no streetlights, just the hum of cicadas and the distant groan of metal turning slowly against the wind. Then headlights appeared. One pair, then two, then a dozen, then hundreds stretching back 2 miles in both directions, a procession of pickup trucks, hauling empty barrels, rusted sedans, pulling horse trailers, flatbed rigs loaded with white plastic totes. They crept along at walking speed, engines rumbling low, and not a single soul among them spoke above a whisper. They carried buckets. They carried 5-gallon jugs and plastic storage bins and old fertilizer drums scrubbed clean with bleach. And as each vehicle reached the gate of the Kirkham farm, the driver would stop, step out, and look up at the towering silhouette of the machine. Some of them took off their hats. Some of them wiped their eyes. Some just stood there staring at the thing they had mocked and cursed and thrown stones at for 12 long years, and they said nothing at all. 12 years earlier, every single one of them had called it Kirkham's Folly. But on this night, they came with empty hands and full hearts begging for water from the only man in Hemlock County who had any left to give. This is how it began. The spring of 2014 arrived in Hemlock County the way a doctor arrives at a bedside with bad news, slowly, quietly, with an expression that said everything before a single word was spoken. Hemlock County sat in the rolling plains of the American Midwest, a patchwork of wheat, corn, and soybean farms that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was the kind of place where a man's worth was measured by the height of his corn in August and the firmness of his handshake at church on Sunday. Families had worked this land for 4 and 5 generations. The soil was in their blood. The rain was their religion. That spring, the rain stopped believing in them. The creeks dropped first. Old-timers noticed it before anyone else. The way the water level in Garvey Creek fell an inch a day, then 2 inches, then 6, until the rocks at the bottom were bleached white and dry as bone. The sky turned a bruised, relentless purple, hanging low and heavy with a heat that pressed down on the chest like a hand. The soil cracked into patterns that looked like the skin of something ancient and dying. Nobody panicked. Not yet. Droughts came and went. This was farm country. You tightened your belt, you prayed a little harder, and you waited for the sky to open back up. But Royce Kirkham was not a man who waited for anything. Royce Kirkham was 67 years old in the spring of 2014. He was lean-weathered and quiet in the way that large bodies of deep water are quiet. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that he was constantly adjusting, and his hands were so thick with calluses that his 12-year-old grandson Kenyon once told him they felt like baseball gloves. He had been a widower for 9 years. He lived on 80 acres of Kirkham land with his daughter-in-law Dinah, who was 38, and held the household together with a combination of fierce love and quiet exhaustion and his 2 grandchildren. Kenyon 12 was a serious boy with his grandfather's gray eyes and an old canvas notebook that Royce had given him, labeled on the cover in Royce's careful hand, Engineer's Apprentice Journal. Gretchen 9 was bright, social, and practical in a way that neither her brother nor her grandfather would ever be. Every evening, while the other farmers of Hemlock County gathered at O'Malley's Tavern To nurse cheap beer and complain about the lack of rain, Royce was locked in his barn. The barn had not housed animals in years. It was a workshop now crammed with blueprints pinned to every vertical surface, a welding torch that hissed and spat blue flame late into the night, and a mountain of scrap metal that Royce had purchased in bulk from the old Burlington rail yard 30 miles east. Salvaged steel beams, riveted iron plates, gears the size of tractor wheels, the front axle of a decommissioned cargo plane. Kenyon would sit on an overturned bucket in the corner of the barn, sketching in his notebook while Royce worked. The old man did not tell bedtime stories. He taught. He would hold up a gear and ask Kenyon to calculate the torque ratio. He would sketch a cross-section of limestone on the back of an envelope and explain how water moved through rock the way blood moves through veins following pressure, seeking the path of least resistance. Kenyon did not always understand, but he wrote everything down because his grandfather spoke to him like he was an equal, and at 12 years old, that meant more than understanding. Gretchen never came to the barn. The noise terrified her. The grinding of metal, the shriek of the welding torch, the deep rhythmic thudding that shook the floorboards of the farmhouse after Royce began construction on the machine. She would sit at the kitchen table with her hands over her ears doing homework, while Dinah stood at the stove pretending the sound was not driving her slowly out of her mind. Because Royce Kirkham was building something. He called it a cyclonic atmospheric condenser and deep strata kinetic pump. To everyone else in Hemlock County, it looked like a 70-foot-tall monument to insanity. The machine rose from the center of the Kirkham property like something out of a fever dream. It was constructed from riveted steel beams and salvaged airplane parts bolted and welded into a lattice tower that groaned when the wind hit it. At the top, four massive blades, broad scoop-shaped structures unlike anything on a modern wind turbine, designed not for speed, but for torque, the slow, grinding, unstoppable kind of force that could turn a millstone, or as Royce theorized, drive a drill bit through 340 feet of solid limestone. The machine had two functions. The upper portion, a network of heavy-gauge copper tubing, threaded through the blade assembly, was designed to condense moisture from the atmosphere, pulling water directly from the air. The lower portion was the real gamble, a massive custom machine tungsten carbide drill bit connected to the central shaft that would use the slow-turning force of the wind-driven blades to bore straight down through the impenetrable hemlock bedrock. Royce believed, based on decades of geological study, that far beneath the limestone lay a sealed, pressurized artesian aquifer, a reservoir of pristine water trapped since the last ice age, 10,000 years of accumulated rainfall, locked beneath a cap of stone that no conventional well could penetrate. The blades caught even the faintest breeze and translated it into immense patient grinding power. Millimeter by millimeter, day after day, the drill bit would descend. It was not a sprint. It was a siege. But try explaining that to a man whose cows are going thirsty. Norris Pickett owned the largest farm in the county, 240 acres bordering the Kirkham property to the south. He was a big man, loud, prosperous by local standards, and possessed of the absolute certainty that the way things had always been done was the way they ought to continue being done. When the drought set in, Norris did what every sensible farmer did. He took out a loan and drilled his wells deeper, chasing the receding water table with expensive equipment and brute financial force. So when the grinding, shrieking, bone-rattling noise of Royce's machine began echoing across the valley at all hours of the day and night, Norris Pickett did not respond with curiosity or even polite indifference. He responded with a veterinary bill. He drove to the Kirkham farm on a Tuesday morning, stepped out of his truck, and walked straight into the kitchen without knocking. He placed a printed invoice on the table in front of Dinah, who was washing dishes, and in front of Royce, who was reviewing blueprints over a cup of black coffee. My dairy cows dropped production 20% since that machine of yours started grinding through the night. That is a real loss, Royce, not theory, not science fiction. Real money coming out of my pocket because you cannot keep your noise to yourself. Royce looked at the invoice. He looked at Norris. His expression was calm, almost clinical, and Kenyon, sitting at the far end of the table with his notebook, recognized the look. It was the same face his grandfather made when he was about to say something that would make someone very angry. Your cows are producing less because they are dehydrated, Norris, not because of noise. Give it 2 more years and your wells will pump nothing but mud. When that happens, you will wish you had listened to me instead of drilling deeper into an aquifer that is already dying. Norris slammed his palm on the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. You are out of your mind, old man. Every farmer in this county is drilling deeper. That is how you survive a drought. You do not build a 70-foot pile of junk and pray for magic. It is not magic, it is physics. It is insanity. And my lawyer is going to make sure you pay for it. Norris left. Royce picked up his blueprints. Kenyon noticed that his grandfather's hands trembled slightly as he rolled them up. Not from fear, from the weight of knowing that he was gambling his family's survival on something no one else could see. The mockery began slowly, the way a brush fire begins with a single spark and a dry wind. The first Sunday after the machine's blades began turning, Mayor Lonnie Prescott stood in the church parking lot after services, pointing a thick finger toward the Kirkham property line, where the top of the tower was visible above the tree line. What in God's name is Royce building out there? Looks like a monument to his own dementia. Kenyon was standing beside his grandfather, clutching his Sunday school Bible, feeling his face burn. But Royce simply adjusted his glasses and offered a calm, almost pitying smile. I am building a future, Ray. The shallow water is going to vanish. The deep water is trapped beneath 300 feet of limestone, and the air is full of moisture nobody knows how to catch. I am going to catch it, and I am going to break the stone. Norris Pickett was standing nearby. He slapped his knee, his booming laugh carrying across the asphalt. Royce, you have spent too much time with those science fiction paperbacks. You cannot squeeze water from the sky, and you sure as hell cannot drill through Hemlock bedrock with a glorified pinwheel. Royce did not argue. He tipped his hat, placed his heavy hand on Kenyon's shoulder, and guided the boy to their rusted Ford pickup. As they pulled out of the lot, Royce murmured words that Kenyon would carry for the rest of his life. Let them laugh, Kenyon. Laughter is just the sound people make when they do not understand what is coming. 2 weeks later, a young woman named Jolene Fairchild showed up at the farm. She was 28, a reporter for the Hemlock Gazette, the county's only newspaper, and she carried a digital recorder and a genuine spark of curiosity in her eyes. She had heard about the machine, and unlike most people in town, she actually wanted to understand it. Royce was delighted. Kenyon could see it immediately. His grandfather so rarely had anyone to talk to about his work, anyone who asked real questions instead of cracking jokes, that the old man practically glowed as he led Jolene through the barn, pointing to blueprints, explaining the mathematics of torque conversion and the geological surveys he had studied for decades. He showed her the central shaft, the drill bit, the copper condensation network. He talked for nearly 2 hours, his eyes bright, his hands moving with an energy Kenyon had never seen in him before. Jolene listened. She took notes. She asked smart, probing questions. And when she left, Royce stood at the barn door, watching her car disappear down the dirt road. And he said to Kenyon, that young woman is going to write something important someday. 1 week later, the Hemlock Gazette published a full-page cartoon depicting Royce Kirkham as Don Quixote mounted on a skeletal horse charging a rusted pile of junk with a broken lance. The headline read, "Kirkham's Folly, Local Farmer Tilts at Windmills While Crops Wither." Kenyon found the paper on the kitchen table before school. He read it with his stomach turning. He looked up at his grandfather, who was standing at the counter pouring coffee. Royce walked over, picked up the paper, and folded it very slowly, very carefully, as if handling something fragile. He set it down and said quietly, "She will write another one someday." Kenyon did not understand the sentence, but he wrote it in his engineer's notebook that night. It would take him 10 years to learn what his grandfather meant. The next 4 years consumed the Kirkham family the way a furnace consumes fuel. Royce mortgaged the lower 40 acres to purchase the tungsten carbide drill bit and the miles of copper tubing the machine required. He poured every remaining cent of the farm's meager income into steel welding gas and replacement parts. The crops received less and less attention. They planted less. They harvested less. Dinner became canned beans, powdered milk, and silence. The holding tank mounted beside the condensation network remained perpetually, maddeningly empty. The humidity in Hemlock County was simply too low. The atmospheric moisture system did not work. But the drill bit turned, slowly, patiently, grinding downward through the limestone inch by agonizing inch, driven by wind that never seemed to stop. Norris Pickett filed a noise complaint, then a formal lawsuit for noise pollution and diminished property values. The court dismissed it on a technicality, but the message was clear. The Kirkham family was no longer merely eccentric. They were the enemy. Bank notices arrived with increasing frequency. Dinah wept at the kitchen table on nights when the numbers simply did not work, when there was not enough money to pay the mortgage and buy groceries and keep the machine running. One of those nights, Kenyon lay in his bed listening to a conversation he was not supposed to hear. "You are killing this family, Royce." His mother's voice was raw, scraped down to the bone. "Do you understand that the children are suffering? Gretchen is being bullied at school. They call her Crazy Wind Girl. She comes home crying every day. And Kenyon, he worships you. He would follow you off a cliff, and I am terrified that is exactly what you are asking him to do." A long silence. Then Royce's voice, lower than Kenyon had ever heard it. "Dinah, I know. I know what I am doing to you, to them. But if I stop now, the death just comes slower. The water table is collapsing. Every farm in this county is going to fail within 10 years. Every single one. I am not building this machine because I am stubborn. I am building it because I am scared." Kenyon lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time he understood something fundamental about his grandfather. Royce Kirkham was not a dreamer lost in fantasy. He was a man who had seen the future and was terrified by it. There was one person in Hemlock County who might have agreed with Royce, but he wanted nothing to do with the Kirkham name. In the fall of 2016, when Kenyon was 14, Royce handed him a small cardboard box wrapped in brown paper and gave him an address on the far eastern edge of the county. "Take this to Virgil Newell. Do not open it. Do not ask him what is inside. Just deliver it and come home." Kenyon rode his bicycle 7 miles along cracked county roads to reach a weathered clapboard house surrounded by dead pecan trees. The yard was neat but lifeless, the kind of property that belonged to a man who had given up on growing things and settled for keeping what remained in order. Kenyon knocked. The door opened. A man of about 74 stood in the frame, tall, gaunt, with deep-set eyes that swept from the box in Kenyon's hands to the name written on the shipping label. The temperature of the man's expression dropped 20 degrees. "Tell your grandfather I do not want it, and I do not want any part of whatever he is building out there. Sir, he just asked me to deliver it. I do not even know what is inside. Virgil Newell studied the boy for a long moment. His eyes lingered on the oil stains on Kenyon's fingers, the calluses forming on his palms, the canvas notebook sticking out of his back pocket. How old are you, son? 14. 14. Virgil repeated the number as if it tasted sour. Your grandfather is the most intelligent man I have ever met. He is also the most selfish. He is right about almost everything except how to treat the people around him. You remember that. He closed the door. Kenyon stood on the porch for a full minute, then set the box against the door frame and rode home. He never told Royce about the conversation, but he wrote every word of it in his engineer's notebook, and on nights when the machine shook the house and his mother cried and his sister screamed at him to make it stop, he would read those words again and wonder what kind of history existed between his grandfather and the gaunt man in the dead orchard. The answer would not come for 7 years. The years between 2015 and 2017 were the years that broke the Kirkham family into pieces that would never quite fit back together. Gretchen, who had always been the practical one, the child who wanted normal things like birthday parties and sleepovers and a house that did not vibrate, began to withdraw. She stopped bringing friends home. She stopped talking about school. At 12, she started eating dinner in her room instead of at the kitchen table. And when Dinah asked why, Gretchen said simply, "Because I can still hear it from down here, Mom. At least upstairs I can put a pillow over my head." Kenyon tried to bridge the gap. On Saturdays, he would walk to Gretchen's room and offer to take her into town for ice cream, a ritual they had shared since she was 6. For a while, she still came. They would sit at the counter at Franklin's drugstore, eating mint chocolate chip in silence, and Kenyon would pretend not to notice when other kids from school walked past the window and pointed. But by the summer of 2016, Gretchen stopped coming. I do not want to be the crazy windmill girl in town, Kenyon. I do not want to be the crazy windmill girl at home either, but at least at home nobody is watching. Kenyon felt the distance between them grow the way he felt the drill bit descend slowly, steadily, and with a grinding inevitability that no amount of effort could reverse. The farm itself was disappearing. By 2017, they had abandoned 60 of their 80 acres to the drought. The remaining 20 produced barely enough to feed the family, and even that required Kenyon to haul water by hand from a creek bed that was more mud than liquid. His grades at school dropped. His teachers, who had once praised his intelligence, began sending notes home about missed assignments and falling asleep in class. He did not tell them that he was awake at 4:30 every morning, inspecting a 70-foot tower, or that he spent his evenings machining parts in a barn instead of doing homework. He did not tell them because he knew exactly what they would say. The same thing everyone in Hemlock County said. Your grandfather is crazy. Stop enabling him. Let the machine die. The town had given up on subtlety by then. The noise complaints had escalated into formal petitions. 37 residents signed a letter to the county commission demanding that the machine be classified as an illegal industrial operation and forcibly dismantled. Mayor Lonnie Prescott read the petition aloud at a public meeting that Royce refused to attend. Kenyon sat in the back of the room, 15 years old, listening to grown men and women describe his grandfather as a public nuisance, a health hazard, and a cautionary tale about what happens when a man mistakes stubbornness for intelligence. He kept his face still and his hands in his pockets and walked home in the dark afterward without speaking to anyone. That night, he sat in the barn and watched Royce work. The old man was bent over a lathe, cutting a replacement, bushing for the secondary gear train, his wire-rimmed glasses fogged with concentration. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge that 37 of his neighbors had just asked the government to destroy his life's work. He simply made the part tested its fit and set it aside for installation in the morning. Kenyon wanted to ask him if he was afraid. He wanted to ask him if there was a threshold of opposition beyond which even Royce Kirkham would consider that the rest of the world might be right and he might be wrong. But he did not ask because he already knew the answer. The answer was the machine. The answer was always the machine. It turned and it ground and it descended, and it did not care what 37 people thought about it, and neither did the man who built it. That was 2017. 1 year later, the future arrived. It came in the form of a snowstorm, violent and sudden, that descended on Hemlock County in the first week of December 2018. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours. Ice formed on every surface, coating the steel lattice of the machine in a glittering shell that added thousands of pounds of weight to the already stressed structure. At 2:14 in the morning, Kenyon was woken by a sound like a cannon shot. The main gear assembly had seized. The blades locked mid-rotation, and the sudden stoppage sent a shockwave through the tower that cracked 2 of the lower support bolts. Royce was out of bed before Kenyon had his boots on. The old man was 71 years old. His heart was bad. His doctor had told him 6 months earlier to avoid physical exertion. But he grabbed his tool bag, pulled on his coat, and walked into the storm without a word. Kenyon followed him to the base of the tower. "Grandpa, do not go up there. We can fix it in the morning when the ice melts." Royce looked at him. Snow was already accumulating on his wire-rimmed glasses, and his breath came in ragged white clouds. "If the blades do not turn, the shaft does not advance. If the shaft stops for more than 12 hours in sub-freezing temperatures, the drill bit will bond to the rock. We will lose 2 years of progress. I have to free the gear now." He began climbing the scaffolding. The metal rungs were coated in ice so thick his gloves could barely grip them. Kenyon watched from below his heart, slamming against his ribs, shouting into the wind for his grandfather to come down. Royce reached the main gear housing at 60 feet. He worked for 20 minutes in the howling dark, his flashlight clamped between his teeth, chipping ice from the frozen gears with a heavy wrench. Kenyon could see him up there, a shadow against the white sky, moving with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who had done this kind of work his entire life. Then the gear broke free. The blades lurched violently, catching the storm wind, and the sudden rotation jerked the entire platform sideways. Royce lost his grip on the wrench. He reached for the railing, his gloved hand closed on nothing but air. Kenyon watched his grandfather fall. It was not a long fall, 70 feet, 3 seconds, maybe 4. But those seconds stretched into something infinite, a silence inside the storm, where the only thing that existed was the shape of the old man's body against the white sky, arms reaching for something that was not there. He hit the frozen ground beside the concrete base of the tower, and the sound was nothing Kenyon would ever be able to describe to another human being. Royce Kirkham died at 2:47 in the morning on December 8, 2018. He was 71 years old. The funeral was held 4 days later at Hemlock Community Church. Pastor Doyle Griswold, a kind man of about 60 with a deep voice and steady hands, spoke about Royce's spirit, his determination, his love of knowledge and invention. He used the word eccentric 3 times. He did not use the word genius once. Kenyon sat in the front pew beside his mother, and Gretchen, who was 13 now, and crying in a way that was not just grief, but relief, the terrible, guilty relief of a child who knows the thing that has been destroying her family is finally over. Kenyon held her hand and felt nothing. He was hollow, emptied out. He looked at the faces of the mourners and saw what they were really thinking. Norris Pickett shook his hand at the door, murmured, "Sorry for your loss, Ken." But his eyes drifted over Kenyon's shoulder toward the farm, calculating the scrap value of 70 feet of steel. Mayor Prescott patted Dinah's shoulder, and said something about better days ahead. And what he meant was, now you can sell the land and be normal again. Jolene Fairchild stood in the back row with her notebook but did not write. She just watched. And there was something in her expression, guilt or recognition or both, that Kenyon filed away without understanding. They all assumed the machine would come down. With the old man gone, the iron monstrosity would be cut apart, hauled away, sold for scrap. The Kirkham family would conform. The noise would stop. Life would return to normal. They were wrong, because when the lawyers read Royce Kirkham's will 3 days after the funeral, there was a clause that nobody expected. Kenyon was to inherit the farm and all 80 acres. But the inheritance was conditional, bound by legal language so specific and ironclad that the attorney reading it paused twice to make sure he had not misunderstood. The machine was never to be dismantled. The gears were to be kept greased. The shaft was to keep turning. These conditions were to be maintained in perpetuity, regardless of cost, regardless of outcome, regardless of whether the machine ever produced a single drop of water. If at any point the machine was stopped, disabled, or destroyed, the land would be immediately forfeited and donated to the state of Kansas. The room went silent. Dinah closed her eyes. Gretchen looked at her brother with an expression that would haunt him for years. "He died because of that machine," she said. Her voice was shaking, pitched high with disbelief. "He died because he climbed it in a snowstorm, and now he is making you die for it too. How is that love, Kenyon? How is that anything but cruelty?" Dinah reached for her daughter's hand. Kenyon said nothing because a part of him, a part he was ashamed of, agreed with every word his sister had just spoken. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling of his room, listening to the wind outside in the silence where the machine's grinding rhythm should have been. The gears had been still since the night Royce fell. The blades had not turned. The shaft had not advanced. And in the quiet, Kenyon felt the full weight of what had been asked of him. He was 16 years old. He had no money, no engineering degree, no plan. He had a dead grandfather, a grieving mother, a furious sister, and a 70-foot tower of rusted iron that the entire county wanted to see destroyed. The next morning, before the sun cleared the eastern tree line, Kenyon Kirkham walked out to the base of the machine. He stood beneath the motionless blades, looking up at the platform where his grandfather had stood for the last time. The wind was light, barely enough to stir the dead grass at his feet. He picked up a heavy grease gun from the workbench in the pump house. He climbed the ladder. He checked the gear housing, cleared the remaining ice from the mechanism, and engaged the starter. The blades caught the wind, groaned, and began to turn. The shaft descended one more fraction of a millimeter into the earth. Kenyon climbed down, set the grease gun on the bench, and stood there with oil on his hands and tears on his face, listening to the machine resume its slow, grinding, impossible work. He had made his choice, not because he believed his grandfather was right, not because he understood the science or trusted the theory. He made his choice because Royce Kirkham had placed a hand on his shoulder outside a church parking lot and told him that laughter was just the sound people make when they do not understand what is coming, and Kenyon was not ready to find out whether the laughter was justified. The machine turned, the drill bit descended, and Kenyon Kirkham began the loneliest decade of his life. Part 2, The Long Silence. The machine did not care that Kenyon was grieving. It did not care that he was 16, or that he had no money, or that his mother cried herself to sleep 3 nights a week. It required grease every 72 hours. It required new shear pins every 6 weeks. It required a human being to climb 50 feet into the air with a wrench and a prayer, because the custom parts Royce had designed could not be purchased from any catalog on Earth. And when they broke, which they did constantly, Someone had to fabricate replacements by hand. Kenyon learned to weld in February of 2019, burning through 4 pairs of gloves and leaving a scar in his right forearm that would never fully fade. He learned to operate the metal lathe in the barn by reading Royce's handwritten manuals, some of which were so technical that he had to sit with a dictionary and work through them one sentence at a time. He learned to machine brass shear pins to within a tolerance of 0.02 of an inch, because anything less precise would shatter under the load of the central shaft. And a shattered shear at 60 feet meant climbing the tower in whatever weather God decided to throw at him. His days followed a rhythm that left no room for anything resembling a normal life. He rose at 4:30 in the morning to inspect the machine before school. After school, he worked on the farm until dark. At night, he sat at his grandfather's battered oak table and read Royce's journals. The journals were not just technical documents. They were the closest thing to a conversation Kenyon could still have with the old man. Between the equations and geological diagrams, Royce had written personal notes, observations about the weather, about the town, about his fears. Kenyon read them the way a shipwrecked man reads the stars, looking for direction in a darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. One night, deep in a volume dated 2016, he found an entry that stopped his breath. "If I am wrong, Kenyon will lose everything. If I am right, the boy will have to carry the weight of an entire county on his shoulders. I do not know which outcome frightens me more." Kenyon stared at those words for a long time. His grandfather had doubted. Royce Kirkham, the man who had stared down an entire town and never flinched, had lain awake at night wondering if he was destroying his own family. And paradoxically, that single crack in the old man's certainty made Kenyon trust him more. Because truly delusional men do not write sentences like that. Truly delusional men do not weigh the cost. Gretchen left in the fall of 2019. She was 15 sharp as a tack, and she had earned a full academic scholarship to a boarding school in Connecticut. Dinah was overjoyed. At least one of her children would escape the gravity of Hemlock County, the drought, the debt, the endless grinding of iron against stone. The night before Gretchen's departure, Kenyon was in the barn replacing a fractured coupling on the secondary gear train. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find his sister standing in the doorway, her suitcase already packed and sitting in the hallway of the house. She was silhouetted against the porch light, and for a moment she looked so much like their mother that Kenyon felt a sharp pang in his chest. "You could come with me," Gretchen said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Sell the land. Let the state take it. Walk away and start over. You are 16, Kenyon. You have a whole life ahead of you." Kenyon looked down at his hands. They were cracked and stained with machine oil, the fingernails permanently blackened despite hours of scrubbing. They were the hands of a man twice his age. "I promised him Gretchen. He is dead, Kenyon. You are not, but you are trying to be." She left the next morning. Dinah drove her to the bus station in the county seat. Kenyon stayed behind to grease the main bearing housing because it was the 72-hour mark and the machine would not wait. He stood in the barn listening to the car pull away, and he did not go to the window to watch. Over the next year, Gretchen called less and less. The conversations grew shorter, more strained, filled with silences that neither of them knew how to fill. The last call came in the summer of 2020. Gretchen's voice was flat, exhausted, stripped of the anger that had at least been a form of connection. "I cannot keep listening to that machine through the phone, Kenyon. I can hear it right now grinding in the background. It is like a heartbeat that will not stop. I love you, but I cannot watch you do this to yourself anymore." Then silence. Kenyon held the phone to his ear for a long time after the line went dead. He did not call back, not because he was angry, but because he could not think of a single thing to say that would make her wrong. By the winter of 2020, the drought had evolved from a regional inconvenience into something that the newspapers were calling a generational catastrophe. Every shallow shale in Hemlock County had either gone dry or was pumping up a mineral-heavy slurry that killed crops faster than no water at all. Farms that had been in families for 100 years were failing. Men who had never missed a mortgage payment in their lives were sitting across from Deanne Gresham at the Hemlock Community Bank, signing documents they did not fully understand, their hands shaking. Kenyon was among them. He sat in Deanne's office on a Wednesday afternoon, his work boots leaving mud on her clean carpet. She was about 50, immaculately dressed, and she looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who keeps failing the same test. But she did not dismiss him the way others did. Instead, she leaned forward and made an offer that was almost worse than contempt because it was reasonable. I can delay the foreclosure 6 months if you sign the Apex contract. One signature, Kenyon. You keep the house, you get water, you live a normal life. The machine stays right where it is. The will says you cannot dismantle it. It does not say you cannot sign a water contract with someone else. Kenyon felt the logic of it settle over him like a net. She was right. Technically, legally, he could sign the Apex deal and still satisfy the terms of the will. He could have water on his fields within a month. He could stop eating canned beans for dinner. He could sleep through the night without worrying about shear pins and gear tolerances. My grandfather did not build that machine so I could buy water from someone else. Deanne sighed, not with anger, just weariness. Your loyalty is going to kill you, Kenyon, just like it killed him. Kenyon left the bank and drove home past fields where Apex Water Consortium crews, in hard hats and reflective vests, were laying massive blue PVC pipes in freshly dug trenches. Their equipment was new, gleaming, efficient. Their trucks bore the Apex logo, a stylized blue wave on every door. They moved with the confident speed of men who knew they were saving a town. The contrast sat in his chest like a stone he could not swallow. The Apex pipeline opened in 2021 with a celebration the likes of which Hemlock County had not seen in years. There was a ribbon-cutting ceremony outside the new pump station, a barbecue with donated beef and fireworks that lit up the dry sky in bursts of red and gold. Water sprayed from the new irrigation pivots in sparkling arcs, and the crowd cheered as if they were witnessing a resurrection. Norris Pickett spotted Kenyon at the edge of the crowd, holding a paper plate of food he had taken for his mother. Norris raised a plastic cup of beer in his direction and shouted over the music. "Hey, Ken, how is the weather up on Kirkham's Folly? You catch a cloud yet?" The laughter from the people around Norris was loud and sharp and meant to cut. Kenyon kept his head down, walked to his truck, and drove home. For the next 2 years, Hemlock County prospered and Kenyon Kirkham disappeared. The Apex water made the fields green again. New trucks appeared in driveways. The hardware store expanded. O'Malley's Tavern added a back room. Farmers who had been on the verge of bankruptcy were suddenly talking about expansion, about new equipment, about the future, a word that had not been spoken with optimism in Hemlock County for nearly a decade. Nobody noticed the water bills creeping up. Not at first. The increases were small, buried in fine print and sub-clauses, a few cents per gallon here, a service fee adjustment there. But by the end of the second year, farmers who had celebrated the pipeline were working twice as hard just to cover their Apex invoices. Kenyon noticed none of this. His world had shrunk to the borders of his 80 acres. He worked the night shift at the county processing plant, standing for 8 hours in a cold room, sorting agricultural waste, earning just enough to keep the mortgage current and buy parts for the machine. During the day, he maintained the tower, repaired what broke, and tried to keep the remaining 20 acres of cropland alive with hand-carried water from a nearly dry creek bed. He ate most of his meals standing up because sitting down at the kitchen table meant looking at the empty chairs. He stopped going to church not because he had lost faith, but because the walk from the parking lot to the door required passing people who either pitied him or resented him, and he no longer had the energy to pretend he did not notice the difference. The only human contact he maintained was the weekly trip to the hardware store for welding supplies, and even that had become a ritual of avoidance, timing his visits for the last hour before closing, when the aisles were empty and the clerk was too tired to make conversation. His hands told the story of those years more honestly than any words could. The knuckles were permanently swollen from gripping cold iron in sub-zero mornings. A crescent-shaped scar on his left thumb marked the night a wrench slipped at 40 feet, and he caught himself on a bolt head rather than falling. The skin between his fingers was cracked so deeply that it bled when the temperature dropped below freezing, and no amount of petroleum jelly could heal what the wind and the machine reopened every day. Dinah Kirkham died quietly in the spring of 2023. A heart condition, the doctor said, though Kenyon suspected it was something less clinical than that. Some people simply run out of reasons to keep going. She had watched her father-in-law die for a machine. She had watched her son sacrifice his youth for the same machine. And somewhere along the way, the cost of witnessing all that devotion had exceeded what her body was willing to pay. Kenyon buried her next to Royce in the Hemlock Cemetery and came home to an empty house. He was 21 years old, and the only voice that spoke to him now was his grandfather's handwriting in the journals he read every night at the kitchen table alone. It was the loneliness that almost broke him. Not the poverty, not the exhaustion, not the mockery that still floated his way whenever he went into town for supplies. It was the silence of the house, the empty chair across the table, the absence of anyone who believed even a little that what he was doing had any point at all. He reached the bottom on a night in January of 2024, so 2 months after burying his mother, though he did not recognize it as the bottom until later. He had come home from the processing plant at 2 in the morning, frozen, his back aching, his hands cracked and bleeding from a 12-hour shift. The bank had sent a third foreclosure notice that week. The holding tank beside the machine was empty, as it had always been, as it had been for 10 full years. The machine groaned and ground and produced nothing. Kenyon walked into the barn. He picked up the fire axe that hung on the wall beside the welding station. He carried it outside and stood in the moonlight in front of the main drive belt, the thick rubber strap that connected the wind-driven blades to the central shaft. One swing. That was all it would take. One swing, and the blades would spin free, the shaft would stop, the drill bit would cease its pointless descent into rock that would never yield anything but dust. He would lose the land. He knew that. The will was explicit, but he would be free. He could walk away, find Gretchen, start over somewhere that did not smell like machine oil and failure. He raised the axe. The wind shifted. The blades groaned overhead, and a piece of paper fluttered out of the breast pocket of his jacket. It landed in the mud at his feet. Kenyon looked down. It was a torn page from one of Royce's journals, a page he had been using as a bookmark for months and had forgotten was there. He crouched down and picked it up, shining his flashlight on the old man's careful handwriting. It was a small diagram, a pressure curve annotated in Royce's precise script, and beside it a note: when pressure reaches 150 pounds per square inch, water will push itself to the surface. No pump required, only patience. Kenyon stood there for a very long time, the axe in one hand, the page in the other, the wind pulling at his jacket, the machine grinding above him in the dark. He lowered the axe, he set it on the ground. He went inside, sat down at the kitchen table and wept. Not because he believed, not because he had hope, but because he understood that if he quit, Now 6 years of suffering would become meaningless, at least while the machine turned the pain was still moving forward. It was still going somewhere, and going somewhere even into the dark was better than standing still. That was the night Kenyon Kirkham stopped being a boy who kept his grandfather's promise and became a man who made his own choice. The months that followed were no easier, but they were different. There was a resolve in him now that had not been there before, a cold, quiet stubbornness that came not from faith, but from the simple refusal to let everything he had already lost be for nothing. In the fall of 2023, after Dinah's death, Kenyon drove to the edge of the county to find Virgil Newell. Virgil was a retired hydrological engineer, nearly 80 years old, living alone in a weathered, clapboard house surrounded by dead pecan trees. Kenyon had met him once before, years ago, when Royce had sent him to deliver a package. Virgil had refused the package and shut the door. This time, Kenyon did not bring a package. He brought a broken valve assembly from the machine's lower pressure, housing a component so specialized that he could not figure out how to repair it from the journals alone. Virgil opened the door and recognized him immediately. His face did not soften. "I am not gonna help you, son. I am not asking you to help the machine, Mr. Newell. I am asking you to help me understand a valve. It is the same thing. Maybe, but I have nobody else to ask." Virgil studied him for a long moment, then stepped onto the porch and sat down heavily in a rocking chair that creaked under his weight. He did not invite Kenyon inside, but he did not close the door. "Your grandfather and I worked together at the Federal Geological Survey in the 1980s. He was the most brilliant hydrologist I ever met. He found anomalies in the subsurface data that nobody else could see, patterns in the limestone formations that suggested something extraordinary was trapped down there. He took his findings to the department head. They dismissed him, called it speculative, told him to focus on conventional aquifer mapping." Virgil paused, staring at the dead trees in his yard. Royce walked out that same afternoon. But before he left, he stood in the middle of the office and called me a coward, in front of everyone, because I chose to stay, because I chose the pension and the steady paycheck over the chance that he might be right. Kenyon said nothing. "I was not a coward. I was careful. There is a difference. But your grandfather never could see it." Virgil looked at the valve assembly in Kenyon's hands. He looked at the boy's cracked, oil-stained fingers. He looked at the scar on his forearm from the welding torch. "How deep is the shaft now?" "About 330 feet according to the journals." Virgil went very still. The rocking chair stopped moving. For nearly a full minute, the only sound was the wind in the dead pecan branches. "If Royce was right, you are about 10 feet away." Then he stood up, went inside and closed the door. Kenyon drove home with his hands shaking on the wheel. In 9 years, across all the mockery and the lawsuits and the newspaper cartoons and the foreclosure notices, not a single person outside his own family had ever suggested that the machine might actually work. Virgil Newell had just said it in 7 words, and those 7 words rearranged something inside Kenyon's chest that had been out of place for a very long time. 14 months later, on a Thursday evening in late October of 2024, Kenyon was sitting on the front porch eating a cold ham sandwich. The air was cool, the sky streaked with the last copper light of autumn. And beneath everything, as it had been every day for 10 years, was the sound. The rhythmic grinding, percussive thud of the drill bit descending through stone. It was the soundtrack of his life, as constant as his own heartbeat. Then it stopped. Kenyon dropped the sandwich. The silence was so sudden and so total that it felt like a physical blow, as if someone had ripped out a piece of the world and left a hole in its place. He was off the porch and sprinting toward the pump house before the bread hit the ground. His mind raced through catastrophic possibilities. The main shaft had snapped. The gears had seized beyond repair. The drive belt had finally disintegrated. If the machine stopped permanently, the will was clear. The land would be forfeit. He threw open the pump house door. The small concrete room smelled of oil and earth and something else, something old and mineral and cold, a scent he had never encountered before. He grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door and aimed it at the central shaft. It was intact. It was turning, but it was turning freely, silently, with almost no resistance at all. The grinding vibration that had rattled his teeth for a decade was simply gone. The bit had broken through. Kenyon swung the flashlight to the pressure gauge mounted on the main pipe. It was a heavy industrial instrument with a brass face and a needle that Royce had installed before Kenyon was old enough to read. For 10 years, that needle had rested on zero, immovable, absolute, a daily reminder that the machine was producing nothing. The needle was trembling. It climbed to 5, then 10, then 20. Kenyon pressed his palm flat against the cold iron of the pipe and felt something he had never felt before. A vibration, faint but undeniable, rising from somewhere impossibly deep. Not water, not yet. Pressure. Compressed gases, ancient and trapped, venting upward through the breach. Kenyon told no one. He had learned long ago that hope spoken aloud in Hemlock County was just an invitation for laughter. Over the following months, he watched the needle climb. 50, 80, 120. By the summer of 2025, it held steady at 150 psi, exactly the number Royce had written on the torn journal page that Kenyon had picked up out of the mud on the worst night of his life. The summer of 2025 was the hottest in Hemlock County's recorded history. The soil turned to powder, so fine it hung in the air like fog. But the county did not panic. They had the pipeline. They had Apex. Until they did not. Kenyon was in town picking up welding rod when he saw a knot of farmers outside the hardware store, their faces flushed, their voices loud with a fear that was trying to disguise itself as anger. Norris Pickett stood in the center, holding a mason jar of water the color of old urine. The smell of sulfur and decay carried 10 feet. The Apex pipeline had turned. Soybeans curling, livestock refusing to drink, 3 hours on hold with corporate, toxic levels of heavy metals in the independent testing, an aggressive bloom of cyanobacteria that turned irrigation water into poison. Apex had overpumped their pristine reservoirs and was now delivering contaminated runoff from stagnant emergency basins, hiding behind contract clauses that absolved them of liability for mineral fluctuations due to acts of God. The town meeting that followed was held in the high school gymnasium, packed to the rafters. Mayor Prescott sweated through his shirt on the podium. The Apex representative cited Section 4B and offered to lease additional filtration equipment at the farmer's expense. The gymnasium erupted. People threw water bottles. Norris Pickett had to be held back by 3 men. Kenyon sat in the last row, his back against the cinder block wall, watching the town that had mocked his grandfather discover that the lifeline they had chosen was a noose. That night, Kenyon drove home under a sky choked with heat and dust. He walked to the pump house. The gauge read 300, maxed out. The pipe was covered in condensation, trembling with contained force. 10,000 years of water, cold and pristine, pressing upward against a valve that had not been opened since the day Royce installed it. Kenyon gripped the heavy red cast iron valve wheel. It fought him with the rust of 7 years. He braced his boots on the concrete floor and pulled with everything he had. He thought of his grandfather falling through the snow. He thought of his mother weeping over bank statements. He thought of the axe in his hands on that January night and the choice he had made to put it down. The rust cracked. The wheel turned. What came next was not gentle. It was a hiss that became a roar, that became something primal, a sound from the deep earth that shook the walls and rattled every bolt in the pump house. The rubber hose connected to the release valve whipped and thrashed, and then water hit the holding tank with the force of a battering ram. Clear, crystalline, freezing cold, violently, overwhelmingly pure. The temperature in the pump house dropped instantly. The air filled with a smell Kenyon had never encountered, clean mineral and ancient ice, the scent of water that had not touched the atmosphere since before human civilization existed. But the pressure was enormous, far beyond what Royce's original design had anticipated. The holding tank screamed at the seams, bolts straining, welds cracking. If it burst, the uncontrolled release could damage the wellhead and seal the aquifer permanently. Kenyon had no instructions for this. Royce's journals covered theory, not the reality of 300 PSI, slamming through aging infrastructure. This was where his grandfather's plans ended and his own knowledge began. He spent the entire night working by flashlight and instinct, using 6 years of intimate familiarity with every pipe valve and joint in the system to improvise. He cannibalized copper tubing from the failed atmospheric condenser, repurposed a salvaged gate valve from the barn, and built a secondary pressure relief bypass that diverted the water flow away from the overtaxed holding tank and into the network of concrete irrigation trenches Royce had laid decades ago, but never used. By dawn, the system was stable. A controlled, steady torrent of water flowed through the trenches and pooled in the natural depression of the lower 40 acres, forming a shimmering pond nearly 2 acres wide. Kenyon stood at the edge of it, soaked, shaking his hands raw from wrenching pipe fittings in the dark, and he understood that he had not merely opened his grandfather's valve, he had finished his grandfather's work. Royce had designed the theory, Kenyon had built the reality. He drove 4 hours to Pace Analytical Services across the state line, registered the water samples under a false name, and slept in his truck in the parking lot. 2 days later, a young technician named Arlo handed him the results with an expression of bewildered fascination. 0 contaminants, perfect pH balance, and a tritium reading of absolute 0, meaning the water had been sealed away from the atmosphere since before the nuclear age, before the industrial age, before recorded history. On the drive home, Kenyon stopped at Virgil Newell's house. The old man answered the door in a bathrobe. He was right, Virgil. The bit broke through. The water is pure, 0 tritium. Virgil sat down on the porch step as if his legs had simply decided they were finished. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he went inside and came back holding a sealed envelope yellowed with age. Royce sent me this 20 years ago. Told me to open it only when someone with the name Kirkham came to my door and said 2 words, 0 tritium. Inside was a hand-drawn geological map annotated in Royce's precise script, marking the exact boundaries of the aquifer. And at the bottom, a single line in ink that had faded but was still legible. Virgil, I am sorry I called you a coward. You were not a coward, you were careful. But Kenyon is going to need your careful mind now. Virgil looked up at Kenyon with red eyes. Your grandfather was the most arrogant man I ever knew, and he played a longer game than anyone I have ever seen. Kenyon pulled into his driveway 40 minutes later and saw a figure sitting on his front porch. Norris Pickett, covered in dust, hollowed out, his usually pristine cap stained dark with sweat. Behind him, his flatbed truck was loaded with empty white bulk containers. You are trespassing, Norris. My calves are dying, Ken. The words came out in a rasp stripped of every trace of the booming confidence Kenyon had endured for 12 years. Norris did not look up. He spoke to his own hands. The Apex Water gave them dysentery. I lost 6 last night. The vet says the rest will not make it past tomorrow without clean water. He raised his head slowly. His eyes were bloodshot wet and utterly desperate. I was driving past your property last night. I saw moonlight reflecting off the lower 40. I thought I was seeing things. I climbed your fence and walked down there and dropped to my knees and drank until I was sick. A tear cut a clean line through the dirt on his face. It is perfect, Ken. The silence between them was heavy enough to bend steel. The machine groaned in the distance, a slow rotation of iron and wind. You laughed at him, Kenyon said. You called him a lunatic. You sued us for noise pollution while he was trying to save this valley. Norris nodded. I did. We all did. We were arrogant fools who wanted the easy way, and now we are paying for it with everything we own. He pulled a crumpled wad of bills and a silver pocket watch from his overalls. His father's watch. He held them out with a hand that would not stop trembling. This is everything I have left. Take it. Take whatever you want. Just let me fill my totes. Please, Kenyon. Do not let my animals die for my sins. Kenyon looked at the money. He looked at the man. He felt something dark and satisfying. Coil in his stomach, the primal urge to turn Norris away, to let him watch his world collapse the way Kenyon had watched his own. It would have been so easy, so justified. But Kenyon looked up at the machine, and he heard his grandfather's voice, not the words about laughter, but something older and simpler. Royce Kirkham was a farmer, and farmers grow life. Kenyon pushed Norris's hand away. Keep your money, keep the watch. Pull your flatbed around to the secondary trench. I will hook up the transfer pump. Norris turned to go, wiping his face with his sleeve. Norris. Yeah, Ken. Tell the others. Anyone who needs water, they come here. Nobody pays a dime. Understood? Norris Pickett, the biggest, loudest, proudest man in Hemlock County, dropped to his knees in the dust of the Kirkham driveway and wept like a child. That night, the county road outside the farm transformed into something Kenyon would remember for the rest of his life. By midnight, a procession of headlights stretched 2 miles in both directions, crawling forward at walking speed. Pickup trucks, sedans, horse trailers, flatbed rigs. They came with buckets, with barrels, with plastic bins, and 5-gallon jugs. Every farmer, rancher, and homesteader in Hemlock County had heard the word. Kenyon stood beside the trench with an industrial hose filling container after container as the line crept forward. Nobody spoke above a whisper. There was no laughter. As each farmer stepped up, they looked at Kenyon, and then they looked up at the tower. Some tipped their hats. Some murmured apologies they had been carrying for years. Some just stood in the dark with tears running down their faces, watching the blades turn against the stars. And somewhere in that long, quiet line, Kenyon understood something that his grandfather had known all along. The machine was never meant to save one family. It was meant to save all of them. Royce had just needed someone stubborn enough to keep it turning until the moment arrived. The moment had arrived. But so had the consequences, because when you cut an entire town free from a billion-dollar corporation, the corporation does not send flowers. It sends lawyers. And when the lawyers are not enough, it sends something worse. Part 3, Rising Water. For 3 weeks, Kenyon Kirkham did not sleep more than 90 minutes at a stretch. His body ran on black coffee, adrenaline, and something deeper than either a sense of purpose so acute that it burned through exhaustion, the way a lantern burns through fog. The distribution operation grew faster than anyone could have planned. Norris Pickett, a man who had spent 12 years tearing the Kirkham name down, now threw every ounce of his considerable energy into building it back up. He organized the nightly water queue into shifts, stationed volunteers at the road to direct traffic, and personally maintained the transfer pumps with a mechanical competence that surprised Kenyon. Norris knew diesel engines the way Kenyon knew the machine. They did not speak about the past. There was no formal apology, no grand reconciliation. They simply worked side by side 18 hours a day, and the work said everything that words could not. Pastor Doyle Griswold set up a triage station on the Kirkham porch, identifying which farms were in the most critical condition and prioritizing their water allocation. Livestock operations came first because dying cattle could not wait for a committee meeting. Crop irrigation came second, focused on fields where the cyanobacteria contamination had not yet killed the root systems. Residential drinking water came last because the town's emergency reserves trucked in from the state capital were still technically potable if you boiled them long enough and did not think too hard about the color. The aquifer did not falter. The pressure held steady. The water ran clear and cold day after day as if the earth itself had been waiting a very long time to be asked. Green shoots began to push through the poisoned topsoil on the farms closest to the Kirkham property. Calves that veterinarians had written off as lost began to stand and nurse. The dying town of Hemlock County was slowly and unmistakably coming back to life. But resurrections draw attention, and attention, when it reaches the ears of a corporation losing it millions of dollars a month, draws something far less holy. The white SUVs arrived on a Tuesday morning, three of them sleek and polished looking, profoundly out of place among the rusted pickups and mud-splattered tractors parked along the Kirkham driveway. Four men stepped out. Three were private security contractors, thick-necked men in tactical polo shirts who moved with the practiced awareness of people accustomed to physical confrontation. The fourth was Warren Treadwell. Treadwell was the regional director for Apex Water Consortium. He was sharp-featured, maybe 45, with hair that looked like it had been cut that morning, and a suit that had never been within 50 miles of a working farm. He carried a thick leather folder and walked straight toward the pump house without introducing himself, without looking at the line of farmers waiting with their containers, without acknowledging that he had just driven onto private property uninvited. "Kenyon Kirkham, I need you to shut this operation down, immediately." Kenyon was standing on the pump house platform, wiping grease from a fitting. He straightened up and stepped down, positioning himself between Treadwell and the valve. "I do not recall inviting Apex onto my property, Mr. Treadwell. You are trespassing." Treadwell produced an emergency injunction from the folder signed by County Judge Leonard Hayes at 6 that morning. It ordered the immediate cessation of all unlicensed water distribution on the Kirkham parcel. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, laced with a particular brand of authority that belongs to men who have never been told no by anyone who mattered. "You are in violation of Hemlock County's 30-year exclusivity contract with Apex. Section 12, Clause C. No resident or entity may distribute water on a mass scale that undermines consortium infrastructure. By giving this water away, you are causing Apex millions in lost revenue and operating an unpermitted extraction site. Your water is poisoning people," Kenyon said, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice carried an edge that made Treadwell's security details shift their weight. "You are pumping toxic sludge and charging families for the privilege, and you have the nerve to stand on my land and talk about permits." Treadwell did not blink. "Our water is within acceptable federal parameters for emergency drought mitigation. Yours is unregulated. Turn the machine off, Kirkham, or my men will do it for you and you will leave in handcuffs." The three contractors stepped forward. Kenyon picked up a heavy steel wrench from the workbench. He knew he could not fight three trained men, but his grandfather had not built this machine so that a man in a tailored suit could shut it down with a piece of paper. "I would not take another step if I were you, city boy." The voice came from behind the Apex vehicles, booming across the yard with a force that made the security contractors freeze mid-stride. Norris Pickett came over the rise of the secondary trench, carrying a 12-gauge shotgun resting casually on his forearm. Beside him was Pastor Griswold, gripping a heavy oak walking stick. And behind them, spreading across the yard in a ragged but unmistakable wall, were the farmers of Hemlock County. Dozens of them. Men and women carrying pitchforks, tire irons, hunting rifles, and heavy chains. They had been in the morning water queue when the white SUVs pulled in, and they had come to the same conclusion without a word being spoken. More trucks were pulling into the driveway behind the Apex vehicles, blocking them in. Treadwell's composure cracked visibly. The color drained from his face. His security detail, tough as they were, had the sense to move their hands away from their belts. They were not going to engage 50 armed, desperate people who had nothing left to lose. Norris racked the shotgun. The metallic clack echoed off the steel holding tank. "You boys from Apex came in here, lied to us, poisoned our land, and drained our bank accounts. This man right here is the only reason we are not all starving. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to get in your shiny trucks and drive back to the city. And if I see a single Apex vehicle within 5 miles of this farm again, I am going to start using them for target practice." Treadwell looked at the crowd. He looked at the uncompromising faces of men and women who had already lost everything that fear could take from them. He backed toward his SUV. "This is not over, Kirkham. You cannot fight $1 billion corporation with a mob. We will bury you in litigation." "Let them try," Pastor Griswold called out, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "We have got deep water now, and we have got patience." The Apex vehicles tore out of the driveway in reverse, nearly taking out the mailbox. Kenyon lowered the wrench. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely set it down. The euphoria lasted approximately 24 hours. Then the paper arrived. Not a single injunction this time, but a barrage so massive that 2 county sheriffs, looking deeply uncomfortable, needed help carrying the documents into the Kirkham kitchen. Apex had filed suits for tortious interference, breach of municipal contract, unauthorized subterranean extraction, and unlicensed commercial utility operation. But the true weapon was aimed not at Kenyon, but at the town itself. Apex demanded immediate repayment of all pipeline infrastructure loans totaling tens of millions of dollars, on the grounds that the county was in active rebellion against their contractual agreements. Mayor Lonnie Prescott appeared at the kitchen door that afternoon, sweating through his shirt. "Kenyon, you have to shut the valve. They are freezing the municipal accounts. We cannot pay the fire department. Deanne says they are threatening to seize the county buildings." "If I shut the valve, the crops die, Ray. The Apex water is still testing positive for contamination. We can boil it. We can buy filters." Norris Pickett, leaning against the doorframe, cut him off. "You walk out of this house, Lonnie, before I throw you out. You sold us to Apex in the first place." But Prescott's panic raised a question that bravery alone could not answer. Kenyon had $1,200 in his bank account. He could not afford an hour of corporate defense attorney time. Apex could keep filing motions until the legal fees alone crushed the county into submission. The standoff at the pump house had been a victory of muscle. The war that followed would be fought on paper, and paper was Apex's native terrain. 3 days after the standoff, Jolene Fairchild drove through the tractor barricade that Norris's volunteers had erected across the farm's access road. Kenyon recognized her immediately, though she had changed. She was in her late 30s now, leaner, harder-edged, carrying a professional camera instead of the spiral notebook she had used at the Gazette. She had left the newspaper years ago. She freelanced now, covering agricultural and environmental stories across the Midwest. But she had never stopped thinking about the Kirkham farm. She had never stopped thinking about the cartoons she had drawn of Royce, the old man's quiet dignity when he folded the paper, and the sentence he had spoken to his grandson that she had overheard through the kitchen window. She will write another one someday. Jolene had filmed the Apex confrontation from the tree line on shaky cell phone footage and uploaded it to a legal blog that night. It had 40,000 views in 48 hours. "I owe your grandfather an article," she told Kenyon, standing beside the pump house with her camera bag over her shoulder. "A real one this time, and I think the world is ready to read it." The cell phone footage was what brought Myrna Beckford. She arrived in a battered silver Volvo on a sweltering afternoon, holding a cardboard box of pastries out the window as a peace offering to the barricade volunteers. She was about 40 with thick tortoiseshell glasses and a wrinkled linen suit that suggested she had driven through the night. She was a senior litigator for the Prairie Environmental Defense Fund based in Chicago, and she had been trying to break Apex Water Consortium's hold on the Red River Valley for the better part of a decade. "You are in extraordinary trouble, Mr. Kirkham," she said, setting her scuffed leather briefcase on the hood of his truck and popping the latches. "Apex is not just going to take your farm. They are going to pursue federal indictment under the Safe Drinking Water Act, claiming your unregulated well is a contamination risk to the regional water table. It is a fabrication, but they have the lobbyists to make it stick." "Then why are you here?" Norris asked, crossing his arms. Myrna looked up at the machine, the 70-foot tower of battered iron turning slowly against the white sky. "Because you are the anomaly. You tapped a closed system that predates every piece of modern water legislation in this country. I want to represent you pro bono because what Apex has done to the Red River Valley is criminal, and you are the first person I have found who might be able to prove it in court." Myrna moved into the guest room and turned the farmhouse into a command post. Maps, geological surveys, and century-old property deeds covered every flat surface. She and Kenyon worked 18-hour days reconstructing the paper trail that Royce had left behind, and what they found was staggering in its scope. Royce had not simply built a machine. He had spent the 1990s quietly purchasing subterranean mineral and water rights from abandoned properties at county auctions for pennies on the dollar. He had been building not just a well, but a legal fortress around it. But Apex understood something that Myrna was still calculating. A court battle against a sympathetic pro bono environmental lawyer would drag their toxic water quality into the national spotlight. It could take years, and their secondary reservoirs were failing now. They could not afford to wait. If the machine broke down, the rebellion would die of thirst before a judge ever heard a single argument. The sabotage came at the end of August during a storm that descended on Hemlock County with a violence that felt intentional. Kenyon was in the barn at 2 in the morning machining a replacement part. The militia had thinned as farmers returned to tend their recovering fields. Only Pastor Griswold and a young ranch hand named Toby were on watch at the road. The sky opened without warning. Rain crashed down in solid sheets. Thunder shook the barn walls so hard that tools jumped on their hooks. And through the chaos, Kenyon heard a sound that stopped his blood. Not the familiar rhythm of the machine at work, but a mechanical shriek, the sound of metal exceeding its tolerances, of systems designed for steady operation being driven to destruction. He threw open the barn doors. Lightning turned the yard white. The blades were spinning at a speed he had never seen, a lethal blur of iron whipping through the rain. The weighted governor, the mechanical braking system designed to feather the blades in high wind, had been disconnected. The storm was driving the machine at 10 times its rated speed, and the surface pipes were never built to handle the pressure being pulled from below. Then he saw them. Two figures in dark rain gear sprinting away from the pump house carrying bolt cutters and a crowbar. They vaulted the fence and vanished into the flooded fields. Kenyon did not chase them. He did not have time. The concrete foundation was cracking. The central shaft was screaming. If it spun out of balance, the kinetic energy would rip the tower from its anchors and collapse it onto the wellhead, burying the aquifer under tons of wreckage. He burst into the pump house. The emergency brake lever, a massive iron bar designed to lock the transmission, was slick with industrial lubricant that the saboteurs had applied deliberately. He threw his weight onto it. Sparks erupted from the contact, but the brake slipped and held nothing. There was one other option. His grandfather had designed a manual lockout pin at the top of the tower directly behind the rotor hub, a fail-safe that could only be reached by climbing the exterior scaffolding. In a thunderstorm, on a machine shaking itself apart, Kenyon grabbed a heavy iron chain and a padlock from the workbench, slung them over his shoulder, and stepped into the rain. The ladder rungs were slick with oil and water. Every bolt of lightning sent a vibration through the steel that threatened to shake his grip loose. At 30 feet, the shaking was so severe his vision blurred. He climbed by feel, by memory, by the knowledge of every rung and rivet that 6 years of daily maintenance had branded into his muscles. At the top, the spinning blades created a wind vortex that tried to pull him off the platform. The central hub was a blur of iron. He had to thread the chain through the rotating spokes of the main gear wheel and anchor it to the frame, timing the insertion to a fraction of a second. If he missed, the spokes would take his arm. He waited for lightning. The sky split white. He lunged, thrusting the chain through a gap in the spinning iron. It caught. The momentum of the blades ripped the chain taut. The recoil slammed his left forearm between the links in the steel frame. He heard the bone break before the pain arrived, a clean snap that cut through the roar of the storm. He screamed and the wind ate the sound whole. The tower groaned, leaning the entire structure, fighting the sudden arrest of kinetic energy. Sparks showered the platform. The blades shuddered, strained, and with a horrific screech of tortured metal ground to a halt. Then silence. Rain on iron. His own breathing. The distant mutter of retreating thunder. Kenyon lay on the grating, clutching his shattered arm, staring at the sky, and he thought about his grandfather lying at the base of this same tower 7 years ago. The machine had tried to kill them both, and both of them had refused to let it fall. Dawn arrived, gray and tentative. Kenyon sat on the porch steps while Pastor Griswold splinted his arm with scrap wood and duct tape. Every heartbeat was a pulse of white fire from wrist to shoulder. But the machine was standing. The well was intact. Norris arrived mid-morning with a soaked canvas bag he had found tangled in the barbed wire of the south fence. The saboteurs, fleeing in the dark, and the rain had snagged it and left it behind. Inside were pneumatic cutters climbing harnesses, and sealed in a waterproof sleeve, a ruggedized digital tablet. They did not call the county sheriff. Prescott's relationship with Apex made local law enforcement unreliable. Norris delivered the bag directly to Myrna Beckford. By 10 o'clock, the farm was a federal staging ground. Black SUVs with government plates bypassed the tractor barricade. FBI agents in windbreakers photographed the severed governor linkage, swabbed the lubricated brake lever for chemical tracing, and cataloged every tool in the saboteur's bag. Special Agent Brody, a man with graying temples and an expression that suggested he had seen enough corporate malfeasance to fill a library, took personal custody of the tablet. The data on the device did not point directly to Apex. They were too well insulated for that. But it linked to a shadow logistics firm registered in Delaware, a firm that federal investigators already knew was funded entirely through Apex's corporate umbrella. The sabotage had escalated the dispute from a civil contract matter to federal criminal territory. Domestic industrial sabotage, destruction of private property, conspiracy. Myrna stood on the porch watching the agents work, and when she turned to Kenyon, the expression on her face was something he had never seen from her before. Not confidence, not strategy, triumph. They panicked Kenyon. They knew they could not starve us out in court before their own contamination became a national scandal. So they tried to break the machine. And in doing so, they handed us everything. She opened a manila folder and pulled out a fragile document yellowed and sealed with red wax that she had extracted from the State Geological Archives. Your grandfather did not just buy random parcels in the 90s. This land was originally part of a federal land grant issued to the Burlington Railway in 1885. The deed includes a sovereign federal provision granting absolute uncontested ownership of any subterranean water source that does not physically connect to a surface municipal watershed. She paused to let the weight of it settle. Your water is isotopically distinct from the Red River system. It is a completely isolated source. Under federal law, Apex has zero claim to it. Their injunction is not just frivolous, it is an actionable violation of federal property rights. Kenyon thought of the sealed envelope at Virgil Newell's house. The geological map Royce had drawn by hand, marking the exact aquifer boundaries. The purchases made at auction targeted with surgical precision. His grandfather had not been gambling. He had been executing a plan that spanned 3 decades. A plan that required someone patient enough to sit at a kitchen table reading journals by lamplight, night after night, year after year, until the pieces fell into place. He drove to Virgil's house that evening, his broken arm in a sling. Together they opened the envelope again and laid the map beside Myrna's legal documents. Every property Royce had purchased aligned perfectly with the aquifer boundaries. Every deed carried the Burlington Railway provision. Royce had known exactly what he was building, exactly what legal framework would protect it, and exactly who would eventually try to take it away. Virgil stared at the map for a long time. Then he looked at Kenyon with an expression that mixed grief, admiration, and something close to awe. I will help you rebuild the machine. It is the least I can do for the most impossible man I ever worked with. Myrna launched the counterattack with surgical precision. She filed a motion to dismiss the injunction and simultaneously initiated a class action lawsuit on behalf of every resident of Hemlock County, charging Apex Water Consortium with extortion, knowing distribution of hazardous water, intentional destruction of private property, and conspiracy to commit industrial sabotage. Jolene Fairchild made the call that turned a county dispute into a national story. She contacted every major network and newswire she had cultivated over a decade of freelance work. By Friday, satellite trucks were parked 3 deep on the county road. Reporters stood in front of the machine, broadcasting live filming, the clean water flowing through the Kirkham trenches while panning to the dead cyanobacteria-choked fields on the other side of the county line. Jolene herself wrote a long-form piece for a national publication, the kind of detailed, empathetic, rigorously sourced journalism that she had always been capable of and that she had betrayed once 12 years ago with a cartoon. She did not mention the cartoon in the article. She did not need to. Everyone in Hemlock County remembered. The public response was instantaneous and devastating. Apex's stock dropped 35% in a single week. Investor calls flooded the corporate offices. The board of directors facing federal indictments from the FBI investigation and a public relations catastrophe that no amount of lobbying could contain fractured. They fired Warren Treadwell, publicly stripped him of his severance, and offered him as a sacrifice to the media cycle. Then they called Myrna Beckford's office and asked for terms. The settlement negotiation took place at the Hemlock Community Center, in the same room where the town had held its disastrous emergency meeting months earlier. Myrna sat at the head of the table. Across from her, a row of Apex attorneys in expensive suits radiated the particular misery of people who know they have lost but are contractually obligated to pretend otherwise. Myrna did not yield an inch. The final terms were historic. Apex was required to void every 30-year exclusivity contract in the valley. All municipal debt related to the pipeline infrastructure was forgiven. The EPA mandated an $80 million soil remediation fund supervised by independent environmental engineers to restore the farmland that Apex's contaminated water had poisoned. And buried in a subclause that Myrna insisted on was a provision that permanently banned any corporate water utility from operating within Hemlock County without a direct public referendum. Kenyon was standing outside the community center when the doors opened and Myrna emerged shaking hands with the county attorney, looking more exhausted and more alive than he had ever seen her. Farmers crowded around, slapping each other on the back, some laughing, some crying, some simply standing still, with the dazed expression of people who have been holding their breath for months and have just been told they can exhale. He saw Norris Pickett leaning against his truck at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, watching with red-rimmed eyes and the ghost of a smile. He saw Pastor Griswold bowing his head in quiet prayer beside the flagpole. He saw Jolene Fairchild, camera around her neck, standing alone near the parking lot entrance, watching the celebration with an expression that was equal parts joy and something heavier. The knowledge that she had been part of the machinery that had tried to destroy Royce Kirkham's reputation, and that no amount of good journalism would fully erase that. And then he saw the car. It was a rental silver parked at the far edge of the lot where the asphalt gave way to dirt. The driver's door opened and a young woman stepped out. She was 19, slender, with dark hair and their mother's jawline. She stood beside the car for a moment, looking across the crowd toward the tall young man with a cast on his left arm and machine oil permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles. Gretchen Kirkham had not been home in 4 years. Kenyon did not move. Gretchen walked toward him slowly at first, then faster, weaving through the crowd until she was standing 3 feet away. Her eyes were red and wet and fixed on his face as if she were memorizing it. "I saw it on the news," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, balanced on an edge. "I saw the machine. I saw you on top of it in the storm." Kenyon opened his mouth and found that no sound would come out. "I am sorry I left," Gretchen said. "I am sorry I told you to walk away. I did not understand what you were doing. I thought you were just keeping a promise. I did not know you were keeping us alive." Kenyon swallowed hard. He thought about the night she had stood in his doorway telling him he could come with her. He thought about the phone calls that grew shorter and the silence that followed. He thought about all the nights he had sat alone at the kitchen table reading their grandfather's journals by lamplight, and how the loneliest part was not the absence of people, but the absence of anyone who believed. "You were right to go, Gretchen, and I was right to stay." Grandpa was right about everything except one thing. He thought one person could carry it alone. He was wrong about that. Gretchen closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around her brother, careful of the broken arm, and they stood like that for a long time while the crowd celebrated around them, and the late afternoon sun threw long shadows across the parking lot. 12 months later, Hemlock County was unrecognizable. The drought still gripped the wider region. Towns 50 miles away were rationing water and watching their fields turn to powder. But Hemlock County was green. The Kirkham Aquifer, ancient and pressurized and seemingly inexhaustible, sustained every farm in the valley through a community-owned cooperative water network that replaced the Apex pipeline. There were no corporate contracts, no hidden fees, no exclusivity clauses. Just clean water managed by the people who worked the land, flowing through pipes they had laid themselves. The machine had been rebuilt. Virgil Newell, at nearly 80 years old, supervised the reconstruction, personally arriving at the Kirkham farm every morning at 6 with a thermos of coffee and a set of precision instruments. A team of local engineers and welders, many of them men who had once signed petitions to have the tower torn down, reinforced the structure with modern steel, installed a new governor system, and upgraded the gear train with heavy-duty components rated for continuous operation. Not one of them submitted a bill. When Kenyon tried to pay them, they shook their heads and walked away. Some debts are not settled with money. Norris Pickett's farm produced the highest yield of winter wheat in the state's history that year. He donated 10% of the profits to the Hemlock County Agricultural Scholarship Fund, a new program established by Pastor Doyle Griswold, who had been elected mayor in a special election after Lonnie Prescott resigned in disgrace. Griswold ran the town with a transparency that bordered on obsessive, publishing every budget line item in the weekly newspaper and holding monthly open meetings where any resident could ask any question and receive an honest answer. It was by all accounts a form of governance that Hemlock County had never experienced before. Jolene Fairchild won a regional journalism award for her coverage of the Kirkham case. The award plaque sat on her desk beside a framed copy of the Don Quixote cartoon she had drawn 12 years earlier. She kept it there not as a trophy or a conversation piece, but as a reminder. Every time she sat down to write, she looked at the cartoon of the old man charging a pile of junk, and she remembered the sound of Royce Kirkham folding that newspaper with quiet, deliberate hands. It kept her honest. Myrna Beckford returned to Chicago, but not before securing a permanent pro bono retainer with the Hemlock County Cooperative, ensuring that if any corporation ever attempted to exploit the valley's water resources again, the legal response would be immediate and overwhelming. She told Kenyon on her last morning at the farm that the Kirkham case had restored something in her that years of incremental grinding environmental litigation had worn away. She did not elaborate on what that something was, but Kenyon saw it in her eyes and he recognized it because it was the same thing he had felt the night the water first roared up from the deep earth. Proof that patience was not futile, that the long game could be won. Virgil Newell became a regular presence on the farm, stopping by twice a week to inspect the machine and share a cup of coffee on the porch. He and Kenyon did not talk much. They did not need to. There was a companionship in their silence that spoke of shared understanding, the particular bond between two people who had loved the same difficult man and had finally found a way to honor him without pretending he had been easy to love. Gretchen enrolled at the State University 40 minutes away, studying environmental engineering. She came home on weekends. She read Royce's journals at the kitchen table, the same volumes Kenyon had read by lamplight for years. And she asked questions that Kenyon could not always answer, questions about flow dynamics and aquifer recharge rates and the long-term sustainability of deep strata extraction. They were her grandfather's questions, rephrased in the language of a new generation, and hearing them in the farmhouse kitchen felt to Kenyon like a conversation that had been interrupted by death and was finally being allowed to continue. On Sunday evenings, Kenyon walked out to the pump house alone. The late sun painted the iron blades in deep copper and gold. The gears turned with a slow, powerful cadence, steady and unyielding, a rhythm that resonated through the steel frame and down into the bedrock below. Kenyon placed his hand against the central pipe, feeling the immense force rising from the darkness beneath his feet, and he stood there until the light faded and the stars came out, and the only sounds were the wind in the blades and the distant murmur of water flowing through the trenches. His grandfather had endured 12 years of mockery, poverty lawsuits, and public humiliation. He had mortgaged his land, broken his family, and ultimately given his life on the frozen scaffolding of a machine that the entire world told him was worthless. He had done it because he understood something that most people learn too late or never learn at all, that the things worth building are the things that take longer than a single lifetime to prove, that the men in suits will always arrive first with their contracts and their pipelines and their easy answers, and that easy answers are almost never free. That real wealth is not extracted from the surface by those who are clever. It is drawn up from the deep and the dark by those who are willing to endure. Royce Kirkham never saw the water reach the surface. He never saw his grandson open the valve, or the town line up with their buckets, or the corporation that had poisoned the valley brought to its knees. He died on a frozen night in December, falling from the machine he had built with his own hands, and the last thing he saw was the winter sky above Hemlock County, and whether he was at peace with what he had done or still afraid that he had been wrong, nobody would ever know. But Kenyon knew this. On the night he had stood in the moonlight with an axe in one hand and a torn page of his grandfather's journal in the other, the choice he made was not based on certainty. It was based on something harder than certainty. It was based on the refusal to let 12 years of suffering become meaningless. And that refusal, that stubborn, irrational, deeply human refusal to quit when every rational argument said he should, had saved an entire county. Sometimes the greatest innovations look like madness until the moment they save us. Sometimes the man everyone calls a fool is simply the man who got there first. And sometimes the most important thing a person can do is pick up a grease gun, climb a ladder, and keep the machine turning, not because they know it will work, but because they promised someone they loved that they would try. The blades turned, the water rose, and the name they had given the machine all those years ago when they threw stones at it and laughed at the old man who built it turned out to be wrong. It was never a folly. It was a promise kept in iron, written in water, and paid for in full.